Okay, let's start. Number 1. Ohyah. The first Book of Enoch does not linger on how the giants began. It moves fast, almost clinically. The Watchers descended, took human wives, and the women bore giants whose appetite the world could not sustain. Genesis 6:4 confirms the same event in a single line, in a different language, in a different manuscript tradition entirely, calling them the Nephilim, the mighty men of old, men of renown. 1 Enoch chapter 6 gives the event a leadership structure the Genesis line does not. 200 watchers, bound by mutual oath on the summit of Mount Hermon, under a chief named Shemhazzah, who is recorded as fearing to descend alone and requiring the other 199 to swear themselves to the same transgression before he would go through with it. The text preserves the mountain's own name as a pun on the oath, Hermon, meaning the place of cursing, a detail Ethiopic scribes copied faithfully for over 1,000 years without ever needing to explain it to their readers, because the readers already knew what had been sworn there. But it is the Book of Giants, recovered from Qumran Cave 4 and first pieced together by the French Dominican scholar Joseph Milik in the 1970s, that gives the giants something the Genesis account never does: names. Ohyah is the first of them, son of Shemhazzah himself, and the fragment that preserves him does not describe a monster thrashing blindly toward destruction. It describes a mind that already suspects what is coming. Not a monster's hunger, a mind that already knew. That distinction matters. The Aramaic fragment, catalogued among the scroll material recovered from the Judean desert caves between 1947 and 1956, gives Ohyah a dream, and the dream is specific in a way that ancient dream reports rarely are. A garden is planted. 200 trees are watered and grown tall, 1 tree for every watcher bound at Hermon. Then gardeners arrive, and they begin uprooting the trees one by one, felling row after row, until every tree in the garden is destroyed but a single root, left standing alone in otherwise cleared ground. Ohyah wakes from this and does not treat it as random anxiety. He treats it as information, and the fragment records him carrying it directly to the assembly of giants rather than keeping it to himself, a detail scholars have read as evidence that dream interpretation functioned inside this community as something closer to civil intelligence than private omen. The single surviving root corresponds, in the internal logic of the fragment, to what the giants themselves seem to already suspect will be spared when the uprooting comes for them, and the assembly's response, according to the surviving lines, is not panic, but immediate deliberation over what to do with the information. The scale of what the giants had already done by this point in the narrative is recorded in 1 Enoch chapter 7, with an escalation that reads less like myth and more like a famine report compiled by someone counting losses in real time. The giants consumed all the produce of men's labor, until men were unable to sustain them. They turned then to devouring mankind directly. When that too proved insufficient, they began sinning against birds, against beasts, against reptiles, against fish, and finally against one another, eating one another's flesh and drinking the blood. That is the specific escalating sequence the Ethiopic text records. Not a single act of violence, but a collapse through every available food source in the created world, category by category, ending in a species eating itself because nothing external remained. The same chapter records what the Watchers themselves had already begun teaching before the famine reached this point: charms, enchantments, the cutting of roots and the properties of plants, knowledge distributed into a population that had already outgrown the world's capacity to feed it, compounding the crisis rather than relieving it. Ohyah's dream arrives inside that collapse, and its content is a giant recognizing, before Enoch says a single word to him, that the collapse has a ceiling, that something is coming to end it before it consumes literally everything left standing. Some ancient traditions hold that Ohyah's dream is the oldest recorded premonition literature in the entire Enochic corpus, older than any Watcher's confession, because it comes from inside the appetite itself, rather than from an angel observing it from outside, a warning generated by the very thing being warned about. The modern discovery record around this fragment is its own kind of confirmation of how close this text came to never surviving at all. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found by accident. A Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Adib, searching for a lost goat near Qumran in 1947, throwing a stone into a cave opening and hearing pottery shatter inside, a sound that led to the first scroll jars being pulled out by hand within days. Cave 4, the specific cave that yielded the bulk of the Book of Giants material, including Ohyah's dream fragment, was not excavated until 1952, and what it produced was not intact scrolls, but roughly 15,000 fragments, a jigsaw of goat skin and papyrus scattered across 2,000 years of cave floor, sorted for over 2 decades by an international team working from black and white photographs before anyone could confirm what stories the pieces actually told. Millick's 1976 publication, The Books of Enoch, Aramaic Fragments of Qumran Cave 4, was the first time in the modern era that Ohyah's name had been read by anyone since antiquity. The giant who dreamed the garden's destruction was himself nearly lost to exactly the kind of destruction his dream described. A text uprooted and scattered until only fragments remained standing in otherwise empty ground, waiting 19 centuries for someone to reassemble the rows. The text does not record whether Ohyah acted on the dream before sharing it. It records only that he was not alone in dreaming, and that his brother, sealed in the same fragment cluster, dreamed something related but not identical. Number 2. Hahyah. Where Ohyah dreamed a garden, his brother dreamed a tablet, and the two dreams together form the closest thing the Book of Giants provides to a matched pair of testimony. Hahyah is named directly alongside Ohyah as the second son of Shemahazah in the same Qumran Cave 4 material, and the Aramaic fragment that preserves his vision treats it as a companion piece to his brothers rather than a separate, unrelated warning. Not two visions of one danger, two warnings pointed at two different endings. That distinction matters. In Hahyah's dream, a single stone tablet is lowered into water. The water does not simply cover it. Fire then passes over the surface of the water, burning above the tablet while it remains submerged beneath, an image the fragment presents without further explanation, the way the earlier Enochic sea-being texts present the fountains of the deep as a structural fact rather than a symbol requiring unpacking. Scholars working on the reconstructed Book of Giants, including Lauren Stuckenbrook, whose critical edition remains the standard reference for the Qumran giant fragments, have proposed that the tablet represents a record, a permanent account of what the giants and watchers had done, sealed by water from below and threatened by fire from above, a record simultaneously protected and endangered by the same two forces the flood narrative would later combine. Water that preserves, fire that destroys. Both present in the same image, aimed at the same object. The motif is not unique to the Enochic tradition. The Babylonian priest Berosus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and preserved only in fragments quoted by later authors including Eusebius, records a considerably older Mesopotamian version of the same idea. In Berosus's account, the god Ea warns the flood hero Sisuthros of the coming deluge and instructs him, before boarding his vessel, to write down the beginning, the middle, and the end of all things, and bury the writing at Sippar, the city of the sun god, so that it could be dug up again once the waters receded and civilization needed instructions on how to rebuild itself. A tablet, buried before a flood, meant to survive the flood and be recovered on the other side of it. A separate and considerably older Sumerian tradition, the wisdom composition known as the Instructions of Shuruppak, dated by scholars to as early as the 26th century BCE and among the oldest pieces of literature ever recovered from any civilization, presents itself explicitly as advice from a father to a son surviving from before a great flood, suggesting the anxiety over knowledge outliving catastrophe was already an old literary convention in Mesopotamia a full 2,000 years before the Book of Giants ever set Hahyah's dream to Aramaic. Hahyah's dream inverts the outcome without changing the object, a tablet submerged and burned rather than buried and preserved. The same anxiety about knowledge surviving catastrophe expressed independently across 3 literary traditions with no direct textual relationship to one another. The two brothers do not sit with these dreams. The fragment records that both giants take their visions to a third figure, one capable of reaching Enoch directly to request an interpretation neither of them can produce on their own, a detail that becomes the substance of the next entry on this list. What makes Hahyah's dream historically resonant beyond its content is an irony the ancient authors could not have anticipated and modern archaeology has confirmed repeatedly. Clay tablets, the actual physical medium of the ancient Near East, are almost never preserved by careful storage. They are preserved by fire. When Austin Henry Layard and later Hormuzd Rassam excavated the palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh between 1849 and 1853, they recovered tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets that had survived intact specifically because the library had been destroyed in the sack of Nineveh in 612 BCE. The fire that burned the palace to the ground did not incinerate the clay. It baked it, hardening soft tablets into fired ceramic that could survive nearly 26 centuries buried beneath rubble and soil, waiting for excavators who had no idea a burned building was the safest possible place to look. The Library of Ashurbanipal exists today in the British Museum precisely because it burned. Hahyah's dream records fire over a submerged tablet as an image of danger. The physical record of the ancient world says the opposite happened to its actual libraries. The danger was frequently the mechanism of preservation. Some ancient traditions hold that Hahyah's tablet corresponds not to a single document, but to the entire body of pre-flood knowledge the giants and watchers had accumulated, a record the flood was meant to submerge permanently, and that the fire in the dream represents not destruction of that record, but its unintended survival through catastrophe. The same paradox the Nineveh tablets and Berosus's buried Sippar writings would each independently insist was true, centuries and civilizations apart from one another. The tablet in the dream is never named. The fragment does not resolve what specifically it recorded. What it resolves is that neither brother could interpret it themselves, and that only one being in the world at that time possessed the authority to explain a vision like this to two sons of a watcher. Number 3. Mahway. The Book of Giants gives Mahway a detail neither of the brothers receives, and the detail is physical rather than symbolic. He can fly. The fragment names him as the son of Barakel, a watcher whose name in the Aramaic tradition carries the sense of blessing, and whom scholars have plausibly identified with Barakijal, one of the 20 watcher chiefs listed by name in 1 Enoch chapter 6, verse 7. A roster that includes Shemahazah himself, alongside figures such as Kokabil, Ramiel, and Asael, each one credited elsewhere in the corpus with teaching a different forbidden art to humanity. It is this parentage, not the collective giant appetite recorded elsewhere in the corpus, that defines Mahway's function within the narrative. He is not sent to eat, he is sent to travel. Not fully giant, not fully watcher, built for the distance between them. That distinction matters. When Ohyah and Hahyah cannot interpret their own dreams, the fragment records that the assembled giants turn to Mahway specifically because he alone among them retains enough of his father's watcher nature to cross the distance to where Enoch dwells, at what the text describes as the ends of the earth, a phrase that recurs throughout the broader Enochic corpus in the sections describing Enoch's own cosmic journeys in 1 Enoch chapters 17 through 36, where the seer is shown the edges of the created world, the storehouses of the winds, the mountains of judgment where the rebellious stars are held, and the places where the luminaries rest before they rise again on their appointed courses. Chapters 24 and 25 of the same corpus add a further landmark to that geography. A fragrant tree standing beside the mountain the text identifies as the throne of God, whose fruit is reserved, the text specifies, for the righteous and holy after the final judgment, a detail that gives Enoch's remote dwelling the character of a place suspended just outside ordinary time, rather than a location on any map the giants themselves could have reached on foot. Mahway's flight is described in the fragment in language that echoes the Watcher's own arrival on Mount Hermon. Sons of heaven traversing distance no ordinary human or ordinary giant could cross. Rising above mountain ranges and open water in a single unbroken passage, the text treats as unremarkable for a being of his particular parentage. He reaches Enoch, delivers both dreams in sequence, and returns with an interpretation neither Ohyah nor Hahyah could have produced without him. An answer the fragment frames as unwelcome but not ambiguous. a coming judgment the giants themselves had already half suspected from inside their own dreams. Mahway is not the only messenger figure the wider Enochic corpus relies on to move information between worlds that cannot otherwise speak to each other. 1 Enoch chapter 13 records Enoch himself performing the same function in reverse, carrying the Watcher's own petition for mercy up toward the divine court and returning with the verdict that no such mercy would be granted, a structural echo the Book of Giants seems to build on deliberately, giving the giants a courier of their own once Enoch had already become the fixed point every faction in the story needed a way to reach. The fragment positions Mahway as the only bridge in the entire narrative between the giants' world and the one being who understands what is coming for it. A messenger built out of the same forbidden union that produced the crisis he is now flying to resolve, carrying the answer back into the same population his existence was itself evidence against. The modern recovery of Mahway's name follows a genuinely separate path from his brothers, and the path itself demonstrates how far this text traveled before any of it reached a library shelf. While the Qumran fragments preserve the Aramaic Jewish version of the Book of Giants, an entirely independent recension of the same text survives nearly 1,000 years later and thousands of miles further east, absorbed into Manichaean scripture. The prophet Mani, writing in 3rd century Mesopotamia, incorporated the Book of Giants directly into his own canon as one of his 7 core scriptures, ranking it alongside his Gospel and his Psalms as essential reading for his followers. And that Manichaean version spread along the Silk Road into Central Asia, where it was translated into Middle Persian, Sogdian, and Uyghur across the centuries that followed, each community rendering the giants' names in whatever script its own scribes used for everyday commerce and correspondence. German expeditions to the Turfan Oasis, led by Albert von Lecoq and Albert Grunwedel between 1902 and 1914, recovered tens of thousands of manuscript fragments from Buddhist, Manichaean, and Nestorian Christian communities that had once flourished along the trade routes there, buried beneath desert sand that had preserved paper and parchment the wet climates of the Mediterranean world could never have kept intact for anywhere near as long. Among those fragments were pieces of the Manichaean Book of Giants, preserving Mahway's name in its own transliterated form, spelled differently from the Qumran Aramaic, but unmistakably the same figure making the same flight to the same distant seer. The British scholar Walter Bruno Henning reconstructed and published this Manichaean version in 1943, cross-referencing it against the Qumran material as it slowly became available in the decades that followed, to confirm that 2 manuscript traditions, separated by language, geography, religion, and roughly 1,000 years, were describing the identical winged messenger without either tradition knowing the other one still existed. 2 civilizations, 2 alphabets, 1 figure crossing between them, exactly as he crosses between giant and watcher inside the story itself. Mahway delivers Enoch's answer to the assembled giants, and the fragment records their reaction as recognition rather than surprise. They already suspected the shape of the verdict. What they had not expected was how soon it would arrive, and how little of what they had built would be permitted to follow them into it. Number 4. Gilgamesh. Among the names preserved in the Qumran Aramaic fragments of the Book of Giants, one belongs to a figure the ancient Jewish scribes did not invent. He is named directly, transliterated into Aramaic letters, and scholars examining the fragment recognize the name immediately for what it was, because it had already been famous for over 2,000 years by the time these fragments were copied. Not a coincidence of 2 similar names. The same name, carried across cultures and set down again, that distinction matters. Gilgamesh, the historical king of Uruk, recorded in the Sumerian king list as the 5th ruler of that city after the flood, credited in the list itself with a reign of 126 years, and immortalized across 12 tablets of the standard Babylonian epic, composed centuries before the Book of Giants existed in any form, appears in the Qumran fragment as one of the giants the text names outright, alongside the name examined next on this list. Scholars, including Millick and later Stuckenbrook, have proposed that this is not confusion or coincidence, but a deliberate cultural fingerprint, evidence that the Book of Giants was composed by Jewish authors with direct, detailed familiarity with Mesopotamian literary tradition, most plausibly during or shortly after the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE, when Judean scribes lived inside the same cultural sphere that had produced and preserved the Gilgamesh epic for a millennium and a half already. Gilgamesh's own city has itself been recovered from the ground. Uruk, modern Warqa in southern Iraq, was excavated beginning in 1913 under the German archaeologist Julius Jordan and continued by successive German expeditions across the 20th century, uncovering the monumental White Temple atop its ziggurat and city walls the epic itself claims, in its opening lines, stretched for over 9 kilometers around the settlement, a boast excavation has shown was not far from the truth. The choice is not arbitrary. Gilgamesh, in the epic tradition, is described in terms that read like a template for exactly the giant crisis 1 Enoch describes. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, physically overwhelming, and initially so oppressive to his own city that the people of Uruk cried out to the gods that their king would not leave their daughters or their sons in peace, would seize the young men for his games and the young women for his bed, a burden the gods eventually answer by fashioning Enkidu specifically as a rival strong enough to check him. A superhuman ruler whose scale becomes the city's burden rather than its protection. The Book of Giants borrows that exact narrative shape, a being of mixed origin whose strength outpaces the world's capacity to contain it, and gives it Gilgamesh's own name to wear. Tablet 11 of the epic carries the detail that would eventually connect this Mesopotamian king to the same flood narrative the Book of Giants assumes throughout, the story of Utnapishtim, warned by the god Ea to build a cube-shaped vessel 120 cubits along every side, seal it with pitch, and load it with the seed of every living creature. Before a deluge, the other gods regretted the moment it began, releasing first a dove, then a swallow, then finally a raven that did not return, to confirm the waters had receded enough for land to reappear. The rediscovery of the epic itself in the modern era is one of the most specific, datable events in the whole history of ancient text recovery. Layard and Rassam's excavations at Nineveh in the 1850s recovered the cuneiform tablets containing the epic, but no one could read them until the British Museum Assyriologist George Smith, working through the collection in the early 1870s, identified and translated Tablet 11, discovering within it a flood narrative that mirrored the Genesis account in startling specific detail. Smith read his translation aloud to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London on December 3, 1872, and the room reportedly went silent at the parallel. The story does not end there. The account was missing several lines, and the Daily Telegraph newspaper funded Smith's return to Nineveh in 1873 specifically to search for the gap. Within days of arriving at the site, Smith recovered a fragment containing nearly the exact missing lines, a discovery so improbable that Smith himself later admitted the odds against it in his own published account of the expedition. The Book of Giants had already recorded Gilgamesh's name among the pre-flood giants roughly 2,000 years before that reading. In a Jewish Aramaic manuscript, no one in that London room in 1872 had any reason to know existed. The flood the Mesopotamian epic describes and the flood the Enochic tradition describes converge on the same figure from two entirely separate literary universes, and the giant this list turns to next is the one Gilgamesh's own epic once named as his greatest adversary. Number 5. Hobabish. He does not appear in the Book of Giants as a king or a messenger. He appears as a guardian, and the ancient literary record makes clear exactly what he was guarding before the giant's text absorbed his name. Not the destroyer of the forest, the thing that was destroyed there and then carried into a different story. That distinction matters. Hobabish is the Aramaic Book of Giants transliteration of Humbaba, sometimes rendered Huwawa in the earlier Sumerian material. The monstrous guardian the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh places in the cedar forest, appointed by the god Enlil specifically to terrify men and keep them from the forest's timber. The epic describes him as wrapped in 7 layers of radiance, a terrifying aura the text calls Melamu, and much of the confrontation in Tablet 5 turns on Enkidu's counsel that the auras must be stripped away one at a time before Humbaba can be approached at all, a detail suggesting his power was understood as something closer to a defensive field than a simple monstrous body. Melamu is not a term the epic invents for him specifically. It appears across a wide range of Akkadian religious and royal texts to describe the visible, almost physical radiance believed to surround gods and, by extension, legitimate kings. Meaning Humbaba's sevenfold aura placed him in the vocabulary available to the scribes who wrote him in a category ordinarily reserved for divinity rather than monstrosity. The cedar forest itself is not fixed to a single location across the many versions of the epic that survive, with different tablets and different scholarly reconstructions placing it variously toward the Zagros Mountains to the east or the cedar-covered slopes of Lebanon to the west, an ambiguity the text itself never resolves. What every version agrees on is the forest's entrance, described as a gate rather than a simple tree line, a mountain pass Humbaba was stationed to guard specifically because it was the one approach a mortal army could realistically use, meaning his death did not just remove a monster from a story, but opened a route that had been deliberately closed. Gilgamesh and Enkidu journey to that forest and kill him despite his pleas for mercy, an act the epic itself frames ambiguously, as a triumph that also unravels something the gods had specifically put in place to protect. The epic does not let the killing go unanswered. Enkidu dies shortly afterward, a death the text presents as punishment sent down by the gods for the guardian's slaying, and for the felling of the sacred cedar alongside him. And it is specifically Enkidu's death that sends Gilgamesh out on the quest for immortality that occupies the remainder of the epic, meaning the entire second half of the most famous story to survive from ancient Mesopotamia is set in motion by the killing of the very guardian the Book of Giants later chose to place beside him on its own roster of the doomed. The Sumerian precursor tradition, preserved on tablets from the Ur-3 period around 2100 BCE and predating the Babylonian epic by centuries, tells a version of the same confrontation across two separate compositions modern scholars label Gilgamesh and Huwawa A and B, meaning the guardian's name was already circulating in written form for well over 1,000 years by the time the Book of Giants was composed. When the Qumran fragment places Hobabish among the pre-flood giants alongside Gilgamesh, it is repeating a pairing that Mesopotamian scribes had already fixed in clay for a millennium. King and guardian, destroyer and destroyed, folded together into a single roster of beings too large for the world that made them. The physical record of Humbaba's face is one of the most distinctive artifacts to survive from the ancient Near East. Old Babylonian terracotta plaques and clay masks depicting his face, a single continuous coiled line representing intestines twisted into a grimacing visage, have been recovered from multiple excavation sites across Mesopotamia and are held today in collections including the British Museum and the Louvre, and scholars believe they were used patropaically, hung in homes specifically to frighten away misfortune, meaning the guardian's own monstrous face was repurposed by the people who feared him into a ward against everything else they feared. The epic's textual history received its most significant modern addition in 2011 when the Iraqi scholar Farouk al-Rawi and the British Assyriologist Andrew George identified a previously unknown tablet in the collection of the Sulaymaniya Museum in Iraqi Kurdistan, purchased on the antiquities market with no excavation record, that supplied 20 lines missing from Tablet 5 for over a century, lines describing the cedar forest itself in unprecedented ecological detail, its birds, its monkeys, and Humbaba's court of demons dwelling among the trees before Gilgamesh and Enkidu ever arrived to fell them. The new lines also reframed the killing itself, adding a moment where Enkidu appears to regret the destruction of the forest more than the guardian's death, a detail entirely absent from every previously known copy of the tablet and unknown to any reader for roughly 3,000 years before George and al-Rawi identified it in a museum drawer. Some ancient traditions hold that the Book of Giants preserved Hobabish's name for the same reason it preserved Gilgamesh's, not as literary flourish, but as a deliberate signal that the pre-flood world the giants dominated was already understood, by the authors writing about it, as a rehearsal for exactly the kind of oppressive overreach Mesopotamia had already recorded once and would eventually watch two Assyriologists spend nearly a century and a half reassembling from broken clay. The pairing of Gilgamesh and Hobabish inside a single Jewish Aramaic fragment, a king and the guardian his own epic records him killing, both absorbed without alteration into a completely different religious tradition centuries later, is treated by Stuckenbrook and other specialists in the field as some of the strongest available evidence that the Book of Giants was never meant as an isolated composition, but as a text in active conversation with the wider literature of its world, borrowing names its earliest readers would have recognized on sight, and trusting that recognition to do work the narrative itself never bothers to explain. Number 6. Naaman. Not every figure tied to the giant's proliferation appears in the Book of Giants fragments at all. One of the names most consistently associated with how the pre-flood corruption spread comes from a different manuscript tradition entirely, recorded first in a single genealogical line and expanded centuries later into something considerably darker. Not a giant, a gate the giant's corruption passed through. That distinction matters. Genesis 4:22 names Naamah as the sister of Tubal-Cain, a descendant of Cain, mentioned in a single clause with no elaboration. One name in a genealogy otherwise concerned entirely with sons. The Hebrew text gives her no action, no story, nothing beyond her place in the line. It is the later rabbinic tradition, specifically Genesis Rabbah, compiled in Palestine sometime in the 5th century of the Common Era, that first expands her role, associating her with the corruption described in Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4, the same chapter that introduces the Watchers, the daughters of men, and the giants born of their union. The medieval Kabbalistic tradition takes the association considerably further. The Zohar, the foundational text of Jewish mysticism, traditionally attributed to the 2nd century sage Shimon bar Yochai, but understood by the overwhelming majority of modern scholarship to have been composed or substantially compiled by the Castilian mystic Moses de Leon in the late 13th century, casts Naamah as a being of extraordinary beauty who seduced angels and demons alike, mothering monstrous offspring and becoming, in several passages, one of 4 mother demons in later Jewish mystical cosmology, named there alongside the considerably more famous Lilith, and a third figure called Agrat bat Mahlat, each assigned her own domain of nighttime affliction in the tradition that grew up around them. Lilith's own now famous backstory, cast out of Eden as Adam's first wife rather than a demon seducing angels from outside it, does not appear this way in any biblical text at all, and is first recorded in this specific form only in the alphabet of Ben Sira, a satirical Hebrew work most scholars date to somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, meaning even Lilith's most repeated origin story postdates Naamah's own first mention in Genesis by well over 1,000 years. The Zohar itself did not reach print for nearly 3 centuries after its composition, first appearing in 2 competing printed editions produced in Mantua and Cremona in 1558, a rivalry between Italian Jewish printing houses that shaped which version of Naamah's story the majority of later readers would actually encounter. The first Enoch corpus itself supports the general shape of this tradition even without naming her directly. Chapter 8 records that the Watcher Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, the instruments of war, while other named Watchers taught different corruptions in parallel, Barakajal teaching the interpretation of the stars, Kokabel the knowledge of the constellations, and a third group of Watchers teaching women the art of cosmetics, the beautifying of eyelids, and the working of precious stones and dyes, arts the text explicitly frames as instruments of seduction that deepened the corruption already spreading across the earth. Naamah, in the tradition that grew up around her single genealogical mention, becomes the human embodiment of exactly that mechanism. Beauty as the entry point through which the boundary between human and Watcher, already broken once on Mount Hermon, kept breaking again on the ground below it, generation after generation, long after the original 200 had descended. What makes her case distinct from every other name on this list is the span of time across which her story was built. A single line in a genealogy, composed sometime before the Babylonian exile. A rabbinic elaboration compiled roughly 1,000 years later. A mystical cosmology built around her a further 800 years after that, in a manuscript tradition originating in medieval Spain rather than the ancient Near East. Printed for the first time in Renaissance Italy, centuries further still, thousands of miles and 3 additional major cultural upheavals removed from the world Genesis first named her in. Some ancient traditions hold that the reason Naama's story kept expanding across so many centuries and so many unrelated manuscript cultures is that the giant's crisis was never fully resolved by the flood. That the mechanism she represents, the boundary between human and something else dissolving through beauty and desire rather than violence, was the one piece of the pre-flood corruption the flood was least equipped to drown, because it required no giant body to carry it forward, only a single line of genealogy left standing quietly in a text otherwise devoted entirely to the men around her. Number 7. Amora. The flood, according to the text that records it, was supposed to end the giants entirely. The biblical record that follows the flood narrative does not fully agree that it did, not survivors of the flood, descendants of exactly what the flood was meant to end. That distinction matters. Deuteronomy chapter 3 verse 11 records the single most specific physical measurement given to any post-flood giant anywhere in Scripture. Og, king of Bashan, is described as the last remaining survivor of the Rephaim, a name used across Deuteronomy chapters 2 and 3, alongside several regional variants the text treats as distinct nations rather than isolated monsters. The name Rephaim itself carries an unresolved ambiguity that Hebrew philology has never fully settled. The same consonants elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible describing not giants but the shades of the dead in the underworld, leaving scholars divided over whether the word originally meant something closer to the mighty or something closer to the departed, two meanings that may not have felt as separate to the text's original audience as they do to a modern reader. Numbers chapter 21 verses 33 through 35 records the specific military campaign in which Og was finally defeated, describing an Israelite army meeting his forces in open battle at Edrei, and, in a formula the text repeats from earlier conquest accounts, leaving him no survivor. Deuteronomy 2:10 and 11 describes the Emim as a people great, numerous, and tall as the Anakim, formerly reckoned among the Rephaim as the Ammonites reckoned them, and verses 20 and 21 of the same chapter add the Zamzummim, another people great and numerous and tall, whom the Ammonites are said to have dispossessed and replaced with the Lord's own help. Og's own bed, the text records, was made of iron, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, measured by the standard human cubit, a length of roughly 13.5 feet. And the verse notes that it could still be seen, at the time the text was recorded, in Rabbah of the Ammonites, offered to the reader almost as an invitation to go and check. Numbers chapter 13 verse 33 provides the account of the Israelite spies sent into Canaan, who report seeing the Nephilim there, the sons of Enoch, and describe themselves in the same verse as having seemed like grasshoppers in their own sight beside them. A comparison the text does not soften, and the 10 fearful spies do not walk back even under later questioning. The consequence the text attaches to that single report is not small. Numbers chapter 14 records the fear the sons of Enoch provoked as the direct cause of an entire generation's punishment, a sentence of 40 years wandering in the wilderness, handed down specifically because the spies' account of the giants convinced the people that the conquest could not be won. Meaning a single description of scale, repeated by 10 frightened men, is recorded as having altered the biblical timeline of an entire nation. 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 18 places a later battle between David and the Philistines in a location named the Valley of Rephaim, just outside Jerusalem, a place name the text treats as already fixed and familiar rather than newly coined, suggesting the giant nation memory had settled into ordinary geography long before David's reign. The prophet Amos, in chapter 2 verse 9, describes the Amorites' height as comparable to the height of the cedars, invoking the same Lebanese cedar imagery the Gilgamesh tradition uses for the forest Humbaba once guarded, an image of scale the ancient Near East seems to have reached for repeatedly when describing something too large for ordinary comparison. The Bashan region these texts describe corresponds to the modern Golan Heights, and the area has produced one of the most striking megalithic monuments in the entire Levant. Rujum el-Hiri, a massive Bronze Age stone structure of concentric circular walls surrounding a central burial cairn roughly 150 meters across and dated by archaeologists to somewhere in the 3rd millennium BCE, was first identified from Israeli aerial survey photography in 1968 and later excavated across several seasons in the 1980s and 1990s. It is known locally and among archaeologists by a name that translates directly as Wheel of the Giants, a nickname attached to it long before its precise original purpose, whether astronomical, funerary, or ceremonial, was ever settled by excavation. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus, writing in Antiquities of the Jews, reports that bones of enormous size, larger than any human proportion, were still being shown in his own era as physical evidence of the earlier giant peoples, a claim modern archaeology has never been able to independently confirm, but one that places the giant tradition as a living, physically referenced belief well into the Roman period. Roughly 15 centuries after the flood, the giants were supposed to have been erased by. The persistence of these names across Deuteronomy, Numbers, Samuel, and Amos, 4 separate books composed across a significant span of Israelite history, suggests the post-flood giant tradition was not a single, isolated legend, but a recurring category the biblical authors returned to repeatedly, a population understood to have survived in scattered pockets long after the flood's supposed reset of the created world. Some ancient traditions hold that Og's iron bed, preserved and displayed for public inspection according to the text's own account, functioned exactly the way the Talmudic measurement of the winged being Ziz's wingspan functions in a separate corner of the same broader tradition, as a structural fact rather than a rhetorical flourish. A precise number offered because the number itself was the evidence, standing in a city for anyone who doubted the story to go and measure it themselves. Whether Rabbah of the Ammonites, modern Ammon, ever actually held such an object is not something archaeology has settled either way, and the bed itself has never been recovered in any excavation of the site. What has survived is the number, 9 cubits by 4, repeated without variation across every manuscript tradition that transmits Deuteronomy, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin alike. A level of numerical agreement across otherwise divergent textual families that the ancient scribes who copied it treated as a detail too important to round off or forget. Number 8. Ohyah. One name on this list is not, in the strictest sense, a separate giant at all. It is the same figure examined first on this list, Ohyah, preserved by a different hand in a different alphabet on a different continent roughly 1,000 years after the Qumran fragment was copied. Not a different giant, a different alphabet carrying the same name forward. That distinction matters, and it may matter more than any other on this list, because it is the clearest surviving demonstration of exactly how close the giant's entire story came to vanishing before anyone in the modern era could read it at all. The Aramaic Book of Giants, recovered at Qumran, was not the only version of this text ever produced. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, the prophet Mani incorporated the Book of Giants directly into Manichaean scripture as one of his 7 canonical books, and as Manichaeism spread eastward along the Silk Road into Central Asia over the following centuries, that text was translated repeatedly into Middle Persian, into Sogdian, into Uyghur, each translation reshaping the giants' names to fit a new script and a new spoken language carried by merchants and missionaries rather than priests working inside a single settled tradition. Ohyah, in these Central Asian recensions, survives transliterated into a form closer to Hahyah, the same consonantal skeleton wrapped in unfamiliar vowels, recognizable to a specialist comparing both manuscripts side by side, but unrecognizable to anyone reading either version cold. These manuscripts were buried for centuries beneath the sand of the Taklamakan Desert at Turfan, in what is now the Xinjiang region of China, until German expeditions led by Albert von Lecoq and Albert Grunwedel excavated the site between 1902 and 1914, recovering tens of thousands of fragments from Buddhist, Manichaean, and Nestorian Christian communities that had once flourished along the trade routes there before those communities themselves disappeared from the region entirely. The material was shipped to Berlin and housed in what became the Berlin Brandenburg Academy's collection, where the scholar Walter Bruno Henning spent years reconstructing the Manichaean Book of Giants from fragments scattered across multiple languages and multiple damaged manuscripts, publishing his landmark reconstruction in 1943 under the title The Book of the Giants in the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies. That same year, Allied bombing raids over Berlin damaged and destroyed a portion of the Turfan collection, meaning the very manuscripts preserving Ahyah's name nearly completed in the 20th century, the exact kind of destruction the Book of Giants had always insisted was coming for the beings it named. Some of what Henning worked from exists today only in his own published transcriptions, the original fragments having been lost or damaged in the same war that was, at that moment, engulfing the city where they were being studied. The full arc of this single name is difficult to summarize without sounding like an exaggeration, and yet every stage of it is independently documented. Composed in Aramaic in the Second Temple period, copied and hidden in a cave near the Dead Sea, lost to human memory for 2,000 years, independently translated and carried 3,000 miles east along the Silk Road inside an entirely different religion, buried again, this time in desert sand, for roughly 1,000 years, recovered by German archaeologists at the start of the 20th century, nearly destroyed a second time by aerial bombardment in 1943, reconstructed by a single scholar working from what survived, cross-checked decades later against a second, unrelated Qumran recovery an ocean away that neither Henning nor his Manichaean sources had any way of anticipating. The giants, according to the text that first named them, nearly consumed every resource the created world had to offer before the flood arrived to stop them, working through the produce of men's labor, then men themselves, then beast and bird and fish, then finally each other, a species that ran out of everything except its own body. Their own story, carried forward across 4 languages and 2 catastrophes over 2,500 years, came almost as close to being consumed by time as they came to consuming the earth itself. If you followed these 8 names, 8 fragments, 3 languages, 1 flood that was never quite enough to end them, subscribe to keep reading the record that almost didn't survive to be read at all. Leave a comment with which name on this list you'd never heard before tonight. Every one of them was nearly lost before anyone got the chance to hear it even once.